Welcome to episode 3 of Strategic Dialogue, a podcast series dedicated to politics, diplomacy, and security affairs in the Horn of Africa. Brought to you by Horn Review in partnership with the Institute of Foreign Affairs, this series unpacks the complex dynamics shaping the region. In this episode, we are joined by Omar S. Mahmood, a seasoned researcher and analyst with over a decade of experience studying conflict and security in sub Saharan Africa. With extensive field research across more than 30 countries, Omar's work focuses on violent extremism, political transitions, and regional security trends, particularly in the Horn of Africa and the Lake Chad Basin. Currently serving as senior analyst for Somalia and the Horn of Africa at the International Crisis Group, Omar has previously worked as a senior researcher at the Institute for Security Studies and as an international consultant on Boko Haram and the Lake Chad Basin crisis. His analysis, featured in Reuters, the Financial Times, and other major publications, offer critical insights into Al-shabab, regional conflicts, and evolving security landscapes. Join us as we discuss Somalia and the shifting dynamics of conflict, governance, and diplomacy in the Horn of Africa and what these mean for the region's future. With your extensive experience as a senior researcher on the Horn of Africa, Omar, what do you see as the most critical research areas that warrant deeper exploration in the region? Given the intricate political, security, and socio-economic challenges at play, what methodologies do you believe are most effective in capturing the nuances of these dynamics and producing impactful analysis?
In terms of critical research areas. So I think reconciliation in the politics of grievance is one research area that's been overlooked or could use a bit more attention here in the Horn of Africa. There's a number of tensions at the community level, at the national level. There's strong trust deficits, whether that's due to history, whether that's due to more contemporary factors, whether that's in relation of how communities and people want to be governed or are governed right now. And so I think there's a wide variety of distrust when it comes to the governing systems and the populations, and then also in some areas between populations. And this changes in different parts throughout the Horn. But I think it's a key factor in terms of holding back progress of the region, because lots of times you might have something that makes a lot of economic sense, for example, but it doesn't really make much political sense, or it doesn't really, it runs into social issues and social challenges. And so I think understanding that and bringing that to the fore, and while each context is going to be quite different, there might also be some key themes that emerge out of that that can put the region on more solid footing. And so that kind of leads to maybe another area, which I think is the wider governance frameworks. There's a lot of questions in the region over just exactly how governments can accommodate diverse populations that are within their territorial control, how they can best serve those populations. So one of the key questions is the nature of federalism, for example. I think this is a question in Ethiopia. This is a question in Somalia. This is a question in South Sudan to some degree. And so understanding how governance frameworks can best be applied in the Horn of Africa case, how the systems can avoid zero-sum politics, how they can maintain stability, especially as the Horn is undergoing a transition. We've seen governments change in Ethiopia and Sudan, and these transitions that have then resulted in periods of conflict as well. We have other parts of the Horn where we haven't had transition, but just by nature, the fact that the current crop of leadership is getting older, at some point we will, whether that's in Djibouti and in Eritrea. We've had an area in Somalia that seems to be continually undergoing a transition. So governance transitions and the appropriate frameworks, how those can best be applied, I think is another area to study. And then, of course, the last one I might just mention quickly is regional integration. How can it unlock prosperity within the region? Why has it been so limited? And I think part of that question is less on the economic side, more on the political side. So how can we integrate wider understanding of politics within the regional integration agenda? And what does that promise hold for the region going forward? In terms of the methodologies, I think I've always been most interested in field research. I think oftentimes there's a lot of debates, especially in capitals, capital cities, but doesn't really capture wider views enough, or is very elite dependent. And of course, elite actors are important because they drive a lot of the show at the end of the day. But I think we can do a better job capturing uh, localized sentiments and their input into some of these processes and what it means for their future going forward.
Now, given the complex and often volatile political security landscape of the Horn of Africa, how do you personally interpret the key factors driving instability in Somalia and the wider region? In your view, what practical approaches or strategies could be employed to more effectively navigate and address these persistent challenges?
About the key factors describing instability. So I think the main key factors, in my view, are political. I think there's a lot of other tensions we see, or fault lines we see, or basically lack of progress or inhibitors to progress we see. But to me, if we trace them back down deep enough, they usually relate to a political factor. And so, I can speak most specifically on the Somali case. I think there's been a fundamental lack of reconciliation within Somalia. And rather than addressing that, there's been an attempt to build a state on top of that, a state that might be able to address it, or a state that can somehow take some of those reconciliation needs into account, but continue to build. But I think that theory has fallen short a bit, and rather than really addressing some of the political, some of the more fundamental, deeper challenges, I think the state building project in Somalia has moved to more or less try to just ignore them at some level, address them in a cursory manner, just so the project can continue building. And so I think that focus on a deeper focus on reconciliation, on addressing some of the political issues, haven't really been dealt with. Similarly, you can argue in the Somali case, there's been a basic political settlement, but it hasn't been that deep. So amongst the elite actors, I think Somalia, even though it shed its transitional label, the government shed its transitional label back in 2012, in some ways is still very much a government in transition, and we see that currently ongoing, where they're trying to finalize the constitution. The fact that that constitution hasn't been finalized reflects that some of these deeper political challenges haven't been addressed. And so I think it's almost twofold. That at the elite level, you've had a basic political settlement, but it hasn't gone down that deep, and it hasn't transitioned that much into something more permanent. And then deeper down, you haven't had sufficient reconciliation for a society that's gone through very significant conflict over the past couple of decades, especially after the collapse of the government in 1991. And so I think the idea has been more to resurrect kind of a central governance state within Somalia, but it hasn't really fully accounted for some of these challenges, I think. And so rather than a pure state building agenda, I think what you need in Somalia is more a peace building agenda. And by that I mean less a technical focus on building the structures of the state, but more a deeper focus on the reasons why there's instability, and how you can build that up, or how you can address that, build that up from a bottom-up level, and combine that with kind of a deeper elite political settlement at the top level. And so I think that's kind of the key for instability. If we look at the security instability with Al-Shabab, if we look at the fault lines within kind of how governance, federalism works in Somalia, I think they relate back to this political question, and both the lack of reconciliation, the lack of a deeper political settlement.
In your expert opinion, what do you see as the most pressing challenges Somalia faces in its state building process? How can both domestic and international actors effectively address these challenges to ensure a more stable and functional state?
What are the most pressing challenges? So a lot of this is what I've addressed in the previous question. That I think security, I think other domestic fault lines, this flows from politics. If you look at the Somali case, I would argue there's three main agendas that have been ongoing over the past 20 years or so, we can say. One is a state building agenda, so to build the structures of a state, and you see that now. You have a federal government in Somalia, you have a layer below that with the member states, you even have in some places a district layer below that. So there's been some progress there, but it's been very much a strong state building approach to resurrect or really fill that gap where there wasn't a state due to the collapse. There's also been a counterterrorism agenda. This has been to fight Al-shabab, to reduce its presence and ensure that the group is not a threat to others outside the region or not even a dominant actor within Somalia. And those two agendas go hand in hand. The building up of the state in some ways is a means to ensure Al-Shabaab isn't as strong as well. The third one is the peace building agenda, and this is what I've talked about, and I think this one has gotten the least amount of attention. And so that's, to me, honestly, the most important one of it, because I think you're always going to have problems in state building, you're always going to have problems in counterterrorism if you haven't addressed kind of some of the deeper aspects within peace building, which is, of course, a long-term process. Um, we don't have the luxury of saying this is the perfect sequencing because so much is happening. I think you have to work on all of them at once. But I do think that peace building side's been given less attention and should be elevated. In terms of kind of international partners, I think what they can do best is to incentivize Somali actors to take these leads. But rather than pushing, or the period where they were kind of in the driving seat uh, in the Somali case, I think that's past. That was maybe more a decade ago when the UN was very dominant, where US UK influence was very heavy. I think that situation is past, and part of it was because that allowed for a federal government to be built up. And so at this point, because that federal government is still dependent on external actors for a lot of support, I think that it's more about incentivizing the government. It's more about incentivizing it to undertake some of these reforms. And so I think, for the international partners, they need to refresh. They might need to have a tough conversation on what they want to see, given that we're in a new phase within the Somali context. A greater deal of coordination. You have new actors in Somalia that weren't there, weren't as present about a decade ago as well, when some of the state building was really being kicked off. So I think there does need to be a refresh in the international partners approach. But we're already seeing shifts within that in any case, dwindling Western interest or support in Somalia as well, greater role from the region or middle powers. And so that balance still needs to come. But I would argue it'd be better for there to be at least a minimum level of coordination. Actors are always going to have different interests, but at least to be centered around some key basic objectives.
On a related note, how do you think the issue of Al Shabaab and other similar terror groups can be effectively addressed? Do you see a path beyond military intervention, such as political engagement, negotiations, or social economic strategies, that could contribute to a lasting solution?
On Al-Shabaab, how can it be addressed? So I think the question with Al-Shabaab should be a two-track approach. So you need a military solution, or you need a military response, I should say. Al-Shabaab is clearly a violent actor, and you can't ignore that aspect or take the pressure off of them militarily. But I think you also need a political solution. And what that means is engagement of the group. What that means is discussing at some point, getting them to outline what they see as their future vision of Somalia, and how that can be integrated or how that can be um, discussed within the Somali federal government as well. And I think these two tracks need to go hand in hand. So what that means is, as you have your military path, you also have a political path that's working. And that might sound contradictory, but I think if you look at conflict resolution in many places around the world, there was a period where governments and non-state actors were basically fighting and talking at the same time. And what that would mean is if you had that engagement track, it kind of changes how you see the vision of how this conflict ends. Do you see it as a military solution, or do you see it as one that ends at the battlefield? I would argue there is no military solution to this conflict. And a lot of actors will say that, but at the end of the day, what is being pursued in Somalia is still pretty much a military solution. But if you take the starting point that at some point there's a political solution here, then it influences the other areas. So it kind of depends on what your final vision of how you see the conflict should be. And in my view, I think it is more of that political solution. And so that means, engagement with the group must occur at some level. Now, this is a long-term process. I'm not saying this is something quick or this is something that would happen overnight. This is not a linear process. It'll probably start and stop. But all of that means it makes sense to lay the groundwork now, to start thinking about how that process can unfold, because otherwise you're losing a lot of valuable time. This is a war that's gone on for 18 years already, and doesn't really have an end in sight. And it probably makes more sense to start some of these processes while the federal government has such strong backup from the international community, because that's where a lot of its support still lies. That's where it remains quite dependent. So it still has an AU operated mission within the country, and technically the latest mission will run for the next 5 years through the end of this decade. So it makes a bit of sense to start while you have that protection and while you have that backup, instead of later on down the line.
How do you assess the regional dynamics from Somalia's security perspective? In what ways do you In what ways do regional alliances, rivalries, and external influences shape Somalia's security landscape? And how should the country navigate these complexities to enhance its stability?
On regional dynamics, I think the challenge for Somalia is that it is both weak and internally fractured, and that invites external actors to play upon its fault lines. So essentially, if outside actors don't get what they want out of Mogadishu, or they're feeling shut out of Mogadishu, they have alternatives. They can go to Somaliland, start talking to Hargeisa. They can start working with the federal member states. There's just a number of different political actors, a number of different administrations in Somalia for them to engage. So you don't have that concentration of engagement with Mogadishu. And I think that's a huge challenge for the Somali environment. And it's part of why I say there needs to be a modicum of coordination amongst the international partners around a basic common objective in Somalia, which I think would be achieving some level of stability. Without that, I don't think anyone can really take advantage of any opportunities in Somalia. And so this dynamic has probably gotten worse over time as the partner landscape has changed. We've seen that shift already. Um, I think middle powers have come into the Somali case. There's a great potential there, a great potential for a lot of partnerships, especially on kind of some of the economic investments. They can bring some much needed capital and infrastructure investment. But at times we also see them approaching Somalia with some baggage, with some previous rivalries, or embedding their engagement in Somalia with some of their other rivalries and approaching it at a zero sum mindset. Now, this comes back to kind of the divisions we see within the Somalia landscape. It's not necessarily the outside actors are creating these divisions, but they are exacerbating them at times, and that allows Somali politicians to take more maximalist positions as they try to outdo their rivals. So I think we need a modicum of unity internally and a rejection of outside interference. Somalia is a very nationalistic and very proud society, but the contradiction is we often see Somali political elites looking outside for legitimacy, for support as well, that they can leverage internally. So I think that's a discussion that needs to happen within Somalia in terms of saying, we have our divisions internally, but we shouldn't be riven by external support uh, on top of that. We shouldn't be beholden to that, which makes kind of addressing some of our divisions even harder.
How can we examine the trajectories of external interventions in Somalia over time, and what key lessons can be drawn to make future interventions more effective and productive? Are there specific patterns or approaches that have either contributed to stability or exacerbated challenges?
On trajectories of interventions over time. Um, I think the key point here is again what I've discussed around lack of coordination. I think that's the Somalia position to lead that, but there needs to be a clear policy. Too often we see basis Somali actors jumping from one engagement to another, and not maybe a wider strategic through line. But we've had a West that's been very engaged on Somalia for 2 decades, but very much focused on the state building project, very much focused on counterterrorism, probably defaulted to a bit of an autopilot approach the last couple of years, and is probably headed into another phase where they kind of are drawing down some of their support going forward. So I don't think we can expect a continuation of what we've seen to date. On the middle power side, I think some of the dynamics I've talked about before in terms of coming with a lot of heightened enthusiasm, interest, and activity, but also some baggage, some tensions with rivals and whatnot. So for Somalia, I think the key part is having that engagement, but keeping the baggage out of it and finding a way to leverage the productive parts of this relationship without going too far down the rivalry parts of it.
There is a persistent fear that Somalia's security dilemma is shaped by strategic proxy confrontations. How significant do you think regional integration is in addressing this challenge? Additionally, how do you assess Ethiopia's regional integration efforts, particularly the trilateral initiative launched by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed in 2018 between Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia? What impact has it had, and what lessons can be drawn from its trajectory?
So in 2018, you had the tripartite engagement, which brought Somalia into the picture. But I think this was more of a leadership pact than something that had a fundamental change on the Somalia landscape. It was basically an approach by Ethiopia to engage more with Mogadishu than the federal member states, and to bring Eritrea within that framework as well. But it was very much centered around the relationship between those leaders, in particular Farmajo, who was president of Somalia at the time. It wasn't institutionally rooted so strongly, and what that meant is once you had changes in leadership, you had that framework kind of fizzle out, and it didn't really last beyond that. And so I think that was one lesson in terms of how you root the relationship between the two countries into something beyond just a relationship between the two leaders, for example, and make that deeper, as in that's something that can then not only make sure the relationship continues, it can also deepen it at the time in terms of expanding the areas of interaction. I think another lesson was the need to make practical gains in terms of that relationship. So when Ethiopia and Somalia were engaged in 2018, there was talk of this kind of 4 ports development and initiative where Ethiopia and Somalia would connect their respective marketplaces through Somali ports and the Ethiopian hinterland. But very little was done to actually address that from 2018 onwards, to the point where we're almost kind of in a similar situation now. Ethiopia and Somalia are currently engaging themselves after the Ankara breakthrough in terms of trying to find a way to connect the Ethiopian marketplace to one of the Somalia port development along its coast. And so it's almost kind of that same dynamic and framework from 7 years ago that we've gone back to after a lot of changes within the region. And so I think another one of the lessons is how to root positive trajectories, and when relations are going good, how to root it into something practical, which can then also ensure the relationship lasts a little bit longer. And so we'll see how that plays out now with the technical talks from the Ankara declaration. But it's good to see that already those talks are being taken up in a much more technical manner than they were after the 2018 agreements as well.
How do you assess the current developments between Ethiopia and Somalia? Do you see genuine political will from both sides to foster a mutually beneficial arrangement, or are there underlying challenges that could hinder sustainable cooperation? What key factors will determine the success or failure of their diplomatic and security engagements post Ankara Declaration?
So I think the relationship right now is currently quite good. It's gotten on much stronger footing since the Turkish mediation. I think we see some genuine goodwill between Addis Ababa and Mogadishu. You can look at this in the diplomatic sphere, the engagement between the leadership, the way they're interacting with each other. We've had visits from both sides to their respective capitals. We can see this in the security sphere. Ethiopia's basically been supporting Somalia much more strongly in the last couple months on as they combat Al-shabab. This has included Ethiopian air power in areas where there are not even stationed troops on the ground. It also includes an agreement for Ethiopia to maintain the locations that they've been holding as part of the AU mission and sort of their bilateral forces as well. So a lot of progress there on the security side, given that the biggest sort of concern with the fallout between Somalia and Ethiopia relations was over the security cooperation and what that would mean if there was a vacuum along their border and how Al-Shabaab could take advantage of that. We also see, as I mentioned, progress on determining the commercial relationship and that sort of sea access question. So a lot of good things happening right now in the relationship. I think it's on an upward trajectory, but there's still serious challenges, of course. Part of it's going to be what can Somalia offer Ethiopia sea access wise that takes into account its needs around distance to the Ethiopian markets, around the infrastructure that's already there and needs to be built, around security as well, securing a corridor. And so it probably helps to have an external backer like Ethiopia that wants to see, like a Turkey that wants to see through this agreement, that wants to see through a relationship that has leverage on both sides, but also interests. But I think likely whatever happens from these Ankara talks is just one part of a wider puzzle. You could get an agreement about Ethiopian access to a port in Somalia, but I don't think that answers the wider questions or isn't the final answer to these questions here in the Horn. So I think there's still some unanswered questions that the region needs to address, and this is really what the last year brought up quite strongly, that there had been some key questions in the region that have gone unanswered for too long. So one is around the question of regional integration and connecting the biggest marketplace in Ethiopia to some of the coastal areas, and how much sense does it make to invest in some of these Somali coastal areas if they're not being connected to the Ethiopian marketplace. And so working on that piece of the puzzle. And then secondly, also, it brought up the question on Somaliland status, which remains unresolved. And so I think these are things the region at some point needs to address because they hold back regional integration. Politics has held it back as well. And it's been hard to move on some of these aspects. And so the whole last year brought up these issues. And I think there's still, even though the Ethiopia-Somali relationship is good right now and it has an external backer in Turkey trying to see it through, I think there's still some wider questions there that the region would be wise to sit down and address at some point. Okay, I think that more or less covers what I was trying to say the first time, so I hope this can be used this time around. Thanks.